Hey folks, it's Sam, and I'm here with Casey Scott, my friend and astrologer and excellent astrological researcher. And as you can see today, we're talking about the natal chart of the USA. And we're going to be doing a sort of rectification or just a clarification of the natal chart of the USA. We have a lot of dates to look at, and I think you'll really like this case study. Casey's done a lot of research on this based on a video that I did about a year and a half ago, and I'm real excited to break this out for you. Welcome, Casey. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Cool. So Casey's going to start with, I'm going to let him talk about this in the beginning here, because I actually, just a quick story, is I just did a video about a year and a half ago where I talked about this Scorpio ascendant rather than in Vedic astrology. It's been, people have been using a Sagittarius ascendant now for years because one astrologer a few years ago changed it, changed the time. And I went back and looked and said, I think Scorpio makes a lot more sense. I didn't even know of the research that Casey had done, and he's going to take it from there about what he discovered and what we're going to be talking about here today.
Yeah, so I watched that video that you did it's like June of 2020, and it was really compelling, and a lot of people commented on it too. I was like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to, just as professional astrologer, wanting to back that up with my own research because that's part of the reason where we're at is like one person does it and everyone's just like, all right, I don't need to do anything and just let it be what it is.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to have it make sense for myself. Right. So I've been just on and off kind of collecting pieces of information here and there. And like you said in your first video, there's an autobiography by Thomas Jefferson, and he says that it was signed late in the afternoon. And that was corroborated by several other people that had documents of that time that said, late in the day, late in the afternoon. And then I found another piece of writing somewhere that said that Manly P. Hall, who is a occultist person and not an official Freemason, but was like an unofficial Freemason, he visited the Library of Congress to get some of this information and said that there was writings that supported between 4:30 and 6 p.m. And he didn't really note the source that came from. But the one thing that really I found and shared with you right away was that I found this chart that was done by an 18th century British astrologer named Ebeneezer Sibley. So he was an astrologer and a Freemason. So those people all had connections with the founding fathers, and right there around the same time, he'd published it in this astrological magazine called The Complete Illustration of Celestial Science and Astrology. So this was 1780, right? So right there at the time. And he was using 10 hours, 10 minutes, which is British time, GMT. So that equals 5:10 local in Philadelphia, where the Declaration was signed. And so then, looking around, there was other variously quoted by 1785 as 5 p.m., 4:50 p.m., and 5:15 p.m. So that's really, really compelling information as far as to support the evidence that you kind of introduced in your video.
Yeah, I don't even remember what official time I landed on because I didn't really rectify it. I just pushed it back into Scorpio because it was, I know when it was originally conceived of, and people were saying Sagittarius, and it was literally people were using like 6 p.m., which is like, again, and mainly because that pushes it into Sagittarius. And I was like, well, what if it's, and it never seemed right to me, Moon in the third and all those planets in the seventh house. You could see the chart up there. And when it goes back to Scorpio, the chart just makes a lot more sense, which we're going to talk about here in a second. As you see, we have, we're going to do a whole kind of unpacking of the chart as a Scorpio chart, including military and all the implications of having the ascendant be Scorpio, and then that big stellium in the 8th house rather than the 7th, Rahu Mercury in the 9th house. So there's a whole lot of reason. And also Saturn aspecting the ascendant and aspecting all those planets in the 8th house. Again, eighth house, eighth house, eighth house. It's like the
Yeah.
whole chart shifts over to eighth house so much more. And the Saturn aspect on the ascendant just seemed to make a lot more sense. And I don't even remember what the exact time was I was using in that video, because it was somewhere in late Scorpio. That's what I was saying. So I was pretty happy and shocked. I didn't even realize of the Sibley chart that was done extemporaneously. And again, people have to understand, when you're looking for research to be credible, particularly with things like birth times, you want to see, was someone there at the moment? Like, my mom remembered it was blah, blah, or my aunt remembered this, something extemporaneous, which happened at the time, even from anybody, which is what the Jefferson and John Quincy Adams and those other people who said sometime late in the afternoon, they all said it, which, by the way, 6 p.m. would have also satisfied that. So again, I understand why it's somewhere around there, but then you have an astrologer. Now, again, this was the guy's profession in 1780s, and he's publishing it in a magazine. Now, again, this is like the reputation. And back then, especially if you called yourself an astrologer, it wasn't like now where everybody's an astrologer because they've, you know, they had, this was their professional reputation. It's like a doctor, like, this is what I do. So you would imagine that he was on top of it.
Right. In the 1780s is like not too far after like pitchforks and you know, torches coming after you, you know, for real. You get, if you wanted to put yourself out there in that way, it's not like right now on a YouTube video, you can get some negative comments. In those days, you could get some real big consequences for doing these types of things, you know?
Indeed. So this is, it's very credible, even if it wasn't, it would be. So the point is this, is that it even from the way I was operating before, knowing that it was late afternoon, that 5:10, 5:15, or 6 p.m. would be kind of a wash. But having the words of an astrologer of the day, marking the time, documenting the time, makes it, that's why when I saw it, I was like, oh, well, okay, then that really makes sense. And that also means that there's no reason to then change it. There's no reason, unless we have a very good reason to say, oh no, it was actually almost an hour later from what this astrologer of the day said. There's no reason to really do that, especially if the chart makes really good sense or even better sense from Scorpio. So that's kind of why I also wanted to bring Casey on to double down on the video that I made before, because now there's more solid research, which is why I also put it out there, because I wanted to see what people had to say. And of course, those astrologers who've been using Sagittarius forever, they were like, oh no, Sagittarius works, Sagittarius. Don't take it away from me. I've already made predictions with Sagittarius, which is always going to be the case. So that's fine. But I want to really just bring it out this way. So that,
like you said, it's an idea, right? We're proposing an idea. And just like if we had gotten that, you know, as an astrologer, if someone says, I'm pretty sure it was right around 5:10, 5:15, and you would just start the reading as if that's the chart. Right. And if it's just, if you start reading it, and then at some point, if that's not clearly not the right time, you're going, man, this isn't right. We're not hitting it, right?
And what we're going to be talking about is really the Scorpio chart, the chart from Scorpio, drawing some contrast to Sagittarius, not so much, but just so you could see the chart this way if you've been doing it the other way. So there was also some other things here. I'm sorry.
An idea to just to allow that to entertain that idea, and if it fits, great. You know, I think it does, and I'm done a lot. Like I said, I've done a lot of research. You've done a lot of research. We both feel pretty strongly about it, and
well, you'll see it.
Do your own research, right?
And you'll see it. Yeah, but the other thing is that we're also going to be using techniques that confirm it, and this is the other thing as well. Is the research just based on, well, I think it's better this way, or are you taking dates, case studies, and seeing, again, one of the things that Casey is doing that is, you know, building on methods that I taught and that I've been doing, is when you use the rulerships and you use the karmas activating based on dasha cycles. I mean, it's not just a capricious sort of, well, I think this is better. We have dates, and you can see all of the rulerships activating and all of this stuff showing in all of these events. Again, like as we go forward, we're going to be talking about all these assassinations and wars, and we have all the dashas, we have all this stuff worked out. So you'll see why we think it. So
and just those types of events, they'd be like, man, we know this happened. We know it was shocking.
Yeah.
We know it was tragic. So I would want to see some sort of shocking, tragic, those types of indications shown in the chart using those principles. It's just science.
Right. Yeah. And so, there are a few other things. You want to wrap this part up, Casey, then we'll move on.
So just to conclude what we were talking about, really that Sibley chart was what really is the very compelling evidence as far as research goes. And based on documents that we know from like historic biographies and autobiographies, we know that they voted on it mid-afternoon, and then there was a pause probably for tea. We're in the 1770s. And then around 5 o'clock, they signed it. So we rectify that to say it's a Scorpio Lagna, rising sign, and the likely nakshatra is Jyeshta, right? And so Jyeshta being this, it means the eldest or the chief, right? And that vibe really matches the way that we conduct ourselves as a country, as like we're the leader of the free world, right? Just that whole terminology is Indra, Jyeshta, Scorpio.
I like how you have it written out. You want to just read this because you wrote this very well. This is very well written. Overall, Scorpio.
Okay, so overall, Scorpio as the ascendant, right? Scorpio is the ascendant with the ruling planet Mars, right? Because you always want to look at where the ruling planet goes to understand the type of experience that we're having with that ascendant. So Mars goes into the 8th house, joins several other planets. That works very well if you consider the Masonic origins, right? It's a secret society. The founding principles of the country are based on Masonic principles. So it's also militarization. 8th house is about war, and it's colonization, taking land from the natives, right? So an 8th house thing is to kind of take control and dominate, right? And then enslavement, we brought slaves over from Africa, and our just general warrior history. So in addition, the USA has this kind of hero leader of the free world, and that fits the Scorpio, Jyeshta, Indra mythology very accurately. Yet that mythology does not reflect the reality, right? We don't live up to the expectation of the Jyeshta mythology. Is he sacrificed himself into the belly of the dragon and to restore the water to the earth. We have that romantic story. We don't necessarily live up to those ideals. So to this day, the US government spends by far the most of its money on the military at the expense of healthcare, education, and so much more. The US military expenditures are roughly the size of the next 7 largest military budgets around the world combined.
Yeah. Very well said. And again, this isn't meant to trash America. And I put this together just to see like the kind of underpinnings of the country. Obviously started as like a revolutionary war, right? We revolted against tyranny, which again, 8th house, destruction, against the tyranny of the king and whatnot of England. And then as we were at the same time, we were slaveholders. We were taking the land from the natives. It wasn't cooperative. It wasn't this. It was back and forth with that. And again, this warrior history, this is very much a lot more Mars, you would say, than Jupiter. A lot more. It wasn't a theocracy. Again, as much as people want to romanticize the one nation under God and God, the founding fathers were very clear to not have God or the king. Separation of church and state is built into every part of the Constitution and the way the framers saw the society, the republic.
Right. It was the freedom to practice whatever religion you wanted to practice.
It wasn't a theocracy. It wasn't based on religion. Okay. Again, they were religious, but the founding fathers and the framers had a separation of powers. They were more, and in some ways, even somewhat paranoid about tyranny and again, in that context, it was breaking new ground. Again, also very 8th house, very, very revolutionary, even as a system of government. because before everything was monarchs. There was still monarchy in Europe. There was a king, even in France. Again, what happened in France is a direct result of probably what happened in America, because not long after you had the French Revolution and they started rising up against Louis XIV, because here's this new country, America. They don't have kings. Why are we being under the thumb of kings? So they were very aware of power being abused. And again, maybe even a little paranoid about it. We're just know the difference with Scorpio. When they're conceiving this country, they're saying, okay, we've been dominated by kings. We're going to try a new way. We're going to blow that apart, break it apart, and start a new way. But while this was happening, there's that idealism. Again, so we're going to talk about the chart here. Let me go just show this world military budget. Again, we have the Scorpio and all this militarism. This is how much U.S. spends relative to other countries. Again, if we slash this in half, everyone in U.S. could have health care. We could have everything. If we would just cut this in half and only spend twice as much as the next, we could have everything. But instead, we don't have health care. We don't have college paid for. We don't have most of the stuff that every other industrialized Western country has. We don't have because of this. And again, this is the big thing. Here in the U.S., we just had this big squabble about spending a paltry, again, $3 trillion over 10 years. And it was like, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for $3 trillion over 10 years? And then 2 weeks later, we passed a $7.8 trillion, if you advance it forward over 10 years, with nobody asking how you're going to pay for it. Nobody asking. Bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats all agree $780 billion for the military this year. Boom. Fine. That's more than the military even asked for. Yet trying to get 300 billion for stuff we need. Forget it. How are you going to pay for it? We don't have the money. Again, this is not my opinion. This is a fact. And so you can see the discretionary spending here. But so again, the thing to realize though is that this rhetoric not matching reality to some extent is also shown by this Rahu Mercury in the 9th house, where there's this idealism, we're a new democracy, we're doing it a new way, and we're enslaving people and stealing all the land from the natives and all this stuff. Just sort of cooked into the chart here a little bit. We see this dichotomy, but you see how this lines up so much more with Scorpio and all these planets in the 8th house. And then Mercury, Rahu in the 9th house. Saturn is aspecting the ascendant very close here and aspecting these planets in the 8th house. So again, this is why we're also a warrior culture, a lot of war continually. And we've been in perpetual war or our armies occupying countries all around the world since World War II even. So the militaristic nature is definitely shown. And again, these are the initial reasons why I favored and said, let's look at this Scorpio again. I'm not sure this is so much Sagittarius. Again, the Masonic indications and that the founding fathers were looking into the secret societies and the secret mystical teachings as well as this Rahu Mercury in the 9th. Again, the rhetoric not matching the reality often, especially of the inspiration. And we were inspiring to the other monarchies of Europe. Yet what were we doing? So these are some overall themes to really understand about the difference between moving this into Scorpio. Casey, your thoughts?
Right. And, like we said, the 8th house has a variety of different, it's a spectrum, right? Where it can be that fear and paranoia and war and enslavement, but it's also that positive of paradigm shattering, right? The monarchy paradigm wasn't working for the lower class people, right? And so as we shattered the paradigm, of course, we take some of the old ways with us, and it's a process to get it all, like just like our own personal growth, as we break out of paradigms of, trauma and drama in our family lines. It's not like we become a perfect angel in that breaking of the paradigm, but there's that quality of it. And you can see in the chart that Rahu in the 9th with the retrograde Mercury is some of those ideals are confused and maybe contradictory, right? Because Rahu has that kind of trying it out without knowing what it's going to do, right? And then Mercury retrograde is trying to figure it out, but maybe a little bit confused, right? So it's like two kind of confused energies in the ninth house of our ideals and our beliefs.
And you can also see, however, this ninth lord moon is in the fourth house. Again, this also makes a lot more sense. This was also another one of the biggest things, even if someone were to go back and watch that video before, because some of the wars on the homeland happened with this moon indicator in the fourth house, because the fourth house of a country chart is the homeland, and also how you feel about your home and your heart. And you see this Raja Yoga, the most powerful Raja Yoga is the ninth lord and the fourth here. When you're looking at Raja Yogas, this is the big one. And it's also aspected by Jupiter, right? And so that ninth lord in the fourth gives this romantic attachment to the homeland, right? That the founding fathers have, and the patriotism, and we all feel it. And even the world sees it to some extent. Again, the America as the beacon of freedom and democracy and whatnot. And yes, it's been that, especially since World War II. We also have to not act like it's always been that. It's since World War II, since we've been the superpower, we've been the lone superpower, quote, democratic superpower. But again, underneath it all, there's been a price to pay, which is to occupy and to hold down other countries, especially when it comes to rapacious greed and corporatism and materialism and capitalism. This has been where it's really shown, is the capitalism run amok and the corporate rule, which is really what's happening here.
Right. And you could, look back on the mythology of Indra, right, where when he slayed the dragon Vitra, he was celebrated like we were after World War II. And then slowly but surely, through the Puranas, he became this kind of lusty, drunken, kind of lose the kingdom and have to call on others to help him win it back, right?
Yeah. And so that boastfulness, that pride, that arrogance, again, we started to get humbled, and that arrogance humbled even since the 60s with the Vietnams and the incursions into other countries. America is no longer, seen in that regard. But again, so I'm just going to read through this sort of succinct paragraph here. As you see, a snapshot view of the Scorpio chart shows 4 planets, including Mars, the ruler, in the 8th house, which again has to do with war, secrets, domination, enslavement. Again, also innovation and research, as well as the 9th house philosophies containing Rahu and Mercury. Mercury is the 8th house ruler. You always have to remember rulerships. And again, this is going to be a case study in those principles, because that's the way Casey and I work. We look at the planets as functional planets, not just their natural status. Mercury might be a gentle planet, but for Scorpio, it's the 8th lord. It's a malefic planet in this context. It's the 8th and 11th lord, the most cruel. So again, we see these things we see the planets as rulers as well. And so Saturn also aspects both that ascendant and the stellium in the 8th house, right? So again, Saturn becomes really much more prominent and dominant in the Scorpio chart.
Right. It's the ascendant and the ascendant ruler, right? Those are two very important things. When you have a planet aspecting both, that's like doubling down that energy.
And the closest aspect of this Saturn in 10th is to the sun here. And so we'll see that when we get into things like some of the assassinations, Saturn's influence on the sun. Excuse me. So, but as we move forward, and again, the Saturn influence on the ascendant can clearly be seen as a sort of Puritan ethic, and still maintains to this day. The USA is certainly the most conservative liberal democracy in the Western world. Anyone who's been to Europe realizes, European societies are much more, you would say, permissive in the context of even things like, topless beaches and whatnot. We still have a kind of Puritan ethic underneath it all. Again, the Puritans came over; they were kind of existing simultaneous. So again, we're the most conservative of the liberal democracies, and that Saturn brings the conservatism. The 8th house also has to do with research, advancement, destroying old paradigms, as was said. This is also affirmed by the sign of Gemini. We really saw this new America accelerate at a breakneck pace after World War II. when we started the Mercury Dasha. Then continue through K2, Venus, and the Sun Dashas. We really saw a lot of that American innovation. Again, but also Rahu Mercury in the ninth shows a sense of inspiration, purpose, and innovation, albeit a confused purpose, especially capitalism, militarism, consumerism, corruption, short-sightedness have all been the hallmarks of recent decades. So as America has become the ascendant, literally, democracy and leader of the free world, all this, we also have to remember historically that's a pretty new phenomenon. It's been since World War II. Before that, the societies of Europe were definitely more influential. And this is why, we were afraid Hitler could take over the world, because Germany was more powerful than the US back then, the economies. And those economies of Europe were more dominant. It was after World War II that we became the dominant free country, so to speak. But look at what it's done. Again, I'm trying to blame America for everything, but all I'm saying is that our corporate engine, our consumerist culture, our materialist culture has been driving the world for decades. And it's actually not just, we're not isolated. It's you either keep up with American consumerism and corporatism and militarism or get buried, because we're like just burying the world with all of our consumerism, for one thing, even though I don't remember what the percentage is of the world population, but it's less than 1/10. We consume almost 25%. Again, where our consumerism and our corporatism and what you would call greed and pollution, all of those things relative to how many people are in America, far outstrip. Now, again, not to mention what we just looked at, things like military budgets and, this kind of stuff. You can just think of the depletion of resources and all of the stuff that America has brought. This expansion, again, you can look at this Rahu Mercury in the ninth, and as well as the eighth house kind of deranged application that is very destructive ultimately. Maybe their best intentions to make life better, but without the maturity to harness the power and the energy. Again, but America has led to a lot of progress, quote, you would say, but it's all simultaneous with capitalism. And that's the biggest thing, capitalism. Nothing can happen without capitalism. This is why capitalists have become the great kings, and everything needs to have a capitalist solution to it. And so we're now seeing those systems being very strained. So
and driven by the United States, that capitalism is focused around the eighth house, right? Which is a lot of our ideology, and what drives the consumerism is this fear of lack, right? And so the scarcity is what drives a lot of people to, think about the pandemic when it started, the toilet paper thing, right? So it wasn't necessarily the fact that it was in shortage, but the panic of there's a shortage and everyone goes out and hoards this. That's a very eighth house thing, because you feel out of control. And the one thing I can control is I got to, go out there and grab a lot of resources, right? So 8 and 2 are always in a dynamic harmonic, right? And so it's in that eighth house, you're like, I've got to make sure I fortify, or else the carpet's gonna come out from underneath my feet, right?
And one of the real principles of understanding the higher purpose and what we call Dharma is evaluating those Dharma planets, those rulers of 1, 5, and 9, that really shows the level of authentic intelligence and wisdom and the capacity to really embody the wisdom that we all think we have and that we're all aspiring to. And with this Scorpio chart, again, you see that Mars and Jupiter, Mars is the first lord and Jupiter is the fifth lord. They both go into the eighth house. And of course, they're with Venus, which is the seventh and 12th lord. And they're with the sun, the 10th lord. And again, so all of these things, like the power of the country, which would be the 10th house or the 10th house ruler, the power goes in the eighth house. So again, the power of the military, of the militarism, and the sort of identity, and the identity, which is the first lord, and Jupiter, which is the inspiration, and also the creativity, which is the fifth house ruler, also go into the eighth house. again, as I say, the one Dharma planet that's the cleanest is the moon. It's the fourth lord in the ninth, and it's really not being tormented by anything. It's just being aspected by Jupiter. So this is why we hold those ideals. We hold those ideals, and that love of the country, of the motherland, and of our tradition is very palpable and very real. And in many ways, it also allows us to not kind of see the things I'm talking about. And there's going to be people that are going to just hate me for saying this, but I have to. But, this is the reality. This is much closer to the reality than again, we can have the shining, city on the hill and all. That's a lot of the romantic vision. And again, some of it has really, compelled a lot of people to want to come to America again, especially since World War II, even before the turn of the 20th century as well. We had a lot of immigrants and whatnot, but especially since we became the dominant superpower democracy, the world there's been enormous progress, like life expectancy, technologies, and all of this have all grown. However, what's also grown is we're on the verge of climate collapse. We're out of resources. Capitalism has gone absolutely bonkers, especially in America, where we billionaires out of control. No one wants to tax. I don't want to get into politics so much, but if you don't understand that the biggest problem is we're run by corporations, I don't really know what else to say, but everything is so corporatized. That's the big problem. And it's gone and by the way, it's gone exponentially worse since the Rahu Dasha. Since here, it's bad and it's getting worse. And, Casey put together this sequence of the dashas here that started. And so that's where we're at. Casey, you want to take us through that?
Yeah. So the Vimshotri Dasha sequence is 120 years long, right? So we're obviously older than that. So it just starts over once it kind of runs out that first time. And we're on the third cycle of the Rahu Dasha, right? And Rahu being this, like we said in the chart, it's in the ninth house, joined the Mercury retrograde. And so those, that's the eighth lord and the 11th lord, the 11th lord being that kind of ruthless ambition, and the eighth lord being that sudden shocking change, right? The kind of breaker of paradigms. And so Rahu acts like what it joins, right? So it's going to act like that retrograde Mercury. And in that time, we're kind of like that 11th lord is really wanting to establish its legacy, right? That's a big 11th house word. And then the 8th house is just really feeling insecure, right? Feeling insecure about our identity, about our legacy, right? And so Mercury for a Scorpio ascendant is the most difficult planet by far, right? It's the planet that really gets us spinning these ideas and these paranoid stories, right? So that's what Rahu's doing. It's kind of doing that in a magnified way.
Notice all the conspiracies. Look at this, August 2016. Yeah. This was really the rise of Trump,
right?
And the recognition. This was like after the Republican convention in 2016, where he was a reality. Even if he would have lost in 2016 that election, he was going to keep claiming that he won. And if we imagine even a Hillary Clinton presidency where Trump had lost, he wouldn't have gone anywhere. He would have just been in exile claiming he won and it was stolen and all this stuff. And notice how the conspiratorial thinking has really escalated since this latest Rahu cycle. Rahu also rules Ardra. He rules Venus and Jupiter in the 8th house, even more significantly. Yeah, so again, we can see we started this Rahu cycle in 2016. I'm sorry, I just wanted to bring that in too, because that's so significant.
Yeah. Right. And, for Scorpio ascendant, Venus is the 7th house ruler, which is our agreements and our ability to kind of get along with everybody. And the 12th house ruler, which is why Scorpio has such a hard time with that, because the 12th house is where everything feels like we can't. It's not accessible. So Venus is that planet that will tend to make us feel like there's no choice but civil war, right? that Venus activates that kind of, I can't make an agreement. That's what it is the 7th house ruler and the 8th house. And it's also the 12th house ruler. So Venus for Scorpio is also just like oh man, getting along with people is such a drag. If I could just make them my enemy, that's where I really thrive. And
or make them go away, because it's a 12th house ruler too. It's like, I just want to hide out. I just want to hide out from them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you also see that again, so we have, first of all, in the chart of a country, the 7th house is literally each other.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, the 11th house is the society, but the 7th house is like the relationship we have with each other, right? We're going to see something.
Yeah.
The first civil war was Venus Dasha. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we literally went to war with each other. Okay. And so if Venus goes into the 8th house, what's happening now is Rahu activates Venus in the 8th house, and this sort of at war, this battle we're having with each other over what? Our philosophies, our paranoid philosophies, which is Jupiter is the philosophies. And this is Jupiter also being ruled by Rahu in the 8th house. So again, Jupiter is also being ruled by Rahu in the 8th house. And so even just to look, I'll just pull up the chart here. This is the USA chart. And if I go to, just go to where we're at now, oops, sorry, pull it up here. If I just go to where we are now in the Rahu cycle, we're in, let's see where we're at. We're in, I'll just pull this up. So we're in Rahu Jupiter now. No, we just went into Rahu Saturn. So we're in the Rahu Saturn now. So and we're in Rahu Saturn through the middle of 2024. So for I'm just looking at this with you. As you see, I didn't even look at it. I didn't look at the exact dasha. So we just started Rahu Saturn. This Saturn aspecting the ascendant. This Saturn aspecting this 8th house. Saturn is also the ruler of this Rahu Mercury in the 9th house, because Saturn rules Pushya. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing these things come to a head now.
It rules both nodes, right? So it rules Ketu and
it also rules Ketu
and Rahu and Pushya, right?
And so Rahu and Pushya.
When you got both nodes, you have this feeling of I'm not whole, right? You feel that feeling of division is the nodes. That's what the division is
and this axis, and this axis around my philosophies against yours, and Saturn is about control. Saturn wants control. I want to control the other person or whatever it might be. So right now we're in Rahu Saturn that just started here. So maybe we'll do another video about that later. I didn't even plan on doing this. So these are all spontaneous. Casey and I had about 10 minutes to talk, and then we just let it rip. So pull up the chart. But so right now we're in Rahu Saturn, but you can see the implications of having just started Rahu, and how it shows these times. And again, this is also part of why we see this Scorpio as being so powerful, as we're going to start looking at some of these events here. Any last things on this, Casey, before we get into some of the events?
Right. I think it's just, when we start bringing up these difficult things, people can start making it bigger than it is, right? But we made it out of 1776, we made it out of 1896. It's not end of days, right? We're just having a difficult time, right? Which can lead to, like we said, it's a spectrum. That 8th house is a spectrum. It can be that
what we're seeing is gigantic shifts. We're gigantic shifts in how we're relating to each other. And we are having civil wars. This is a civil war of sorts. Hopefully it's not going to be one where we're shooting at each other with military, but we're definitely, the culture wars are no longer we're living in bifurcated realities, and the danger is clear. Mm-hmm. So it's going to destroy something. And our destructive nature, again, our country was built on a destructive premise. It's Scorpio with all these planets in the 8th house. And now those 8th house planets are getting activated by the Dasha. Mm-hmm. And so things are going to shift and change. Again, the last time we went through, when we went through Venus Dasha, we had the war, the Civil War. But here, let's look at some of these dates here, and I've broken them out. So I'm just going to go through some of these and just look at them, just kind of list them, and then we can go back and categorize them and look at them in context. So we had the War of 1812. By the way, I have them listed here. As you see, the war, I have them in green. So these are some of the war things that led to war or terrorist attacks and whatnot, warlike events. So War of 1812, June 18th, 1812, Saturn Dasha. Saturn had just started. Saturn rules Rahu and Mercury in Cancer, Pusha. Also Ketu and the Moon, fourth house, the homeland. And he's also, again, aspecting the ascendant and aspecting those planets in the eighth. So again, this is why Saturn becomes very, especially important on the homeland because of his aspect to the ascendant as well. So again, but also the rulership of the eighth lord. This is a very important one for the war. War
Those
is about
principles
eighth house.
we were talking about at the beginning. Those principles of, we will want to see what is the karaka of the eighth house? Saturn. What is the ruler of the eighth house? Mercury, which is ruled by Saturn. And what are the planets in the eighth house? And those are all the things that once we start to see those principles start piling up, then we know we're really getting into the what I call hot karmas.
Yeah, this is, and again, these are the principles that we use to rectify. We're not just saying pulling out. We have dates, and you'll see these same principles. The planets activate what they rule. Or I'm sorry, and so in the dasha cycles, they activate the things they rule. They also rule houses. By the way, Saturn is also the fourth house ruler. So again, the War of 1812 was also a war at the homeland. It wasn't somewhere else. It wasn't, we're used to fighting a war in Iraq, going and, imperialistic, fighting a war somewhere else so we don't have to fight it at home. That was the big, justification for going to another country and basically killing the people so that we don't have to kill at home. Okay, well, War of 1812 was a war at home. And Saturn rules the moon in the fourth house. Again, I said the fourth house is the homeland. So this was also literally a war on the homeland, and Saturn is the fourth house ruler. Civil War, April 12th, 1861. This is Venus Rahu. So Rahu is in the ninth with the eighth house lord. Again, the nodes first give the results of the planets they're joined. That's the first thing. And Venus is in the eighth house in Rahu's nakshatra. So again, Venus is literally in that eighth house. And so what happened is in Venus Rahu, again, you look at what Rahu, it's usually the secondary dasha planet is the one that really produces the karmas that are ripe. The Mahadasha is a long cycle, like Venus is 20 years, right? But then that secondary one shows a sort of confluence of what the Mahadasha ruler is doing and what the secondary dasha is also ruling. And so again, as we see here with the chart, again, in Saturn dasha, we had Saturn ruling Pusha here, ruling this, aspecting the ascendant, ruling the moon and Ketu. So in Venus Rahu, Venus is here. It doesn't rule anything, especially in the Rashi chart. Again, we're not even looking in harmonic charts, but in the Rashi chart, it doesn't rule any planets, but it rules the 7th and 12th houses. But Rahu, again, is the ruler of Venus and Jupiter in the 8th house. Rahu is also joined the 8th lord, retrograde 8th lord, in the 9th. So again, the Civil War was fought. It was a war of philosophies. It was literally a philosophy of half the country wants to maintain slave ownership and this way of life, again, under the guise of states' rights and all the stuff that happened, all the philosophies of that. And the North said, no, the philosophy isn't working anymore. We've changed philosophically, and really the Civil War was very much a philosophical war, very much like the war we're in right now. A different one, but a similar one in that they didn't want to continue enslaving. This was the big theme, especially from the North. The South was protesting and saying, oh, it's a states' rights issue. The North was like, no, I don't care what you call it. You're enslaving people. That was the big philosophical driver. Casey, I would like to add to this.
And like you said, it was a change of ideology. So that paradigm breaking again, that eighth house trying to break the paradigm of the way we've always done things, right? That was the way it was for a lot of those people. It was born and raised with slave ownership, and now it's like we got to get away from that. We've got to break that paradigm. And the Scorpio ascendant, especially with the Mars in the eighth house, is wired to that. It's impermanent. We've got to change, right?
Yeah. And so you can see this fracture of the people. And by the way, like I said, the seventh house in a chart are the people. That's the people. And Rahu is ruling the seventh lord in the eighth, in Venus Rahu. Now, it's very interesting to look and go back and see the origin of the Civil War. One of the main cultural origins of the shift in philosophy was the publishing of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book was published at the very end of Ketu Dasha. We have to understand that Ketu Dasha is a fast Dasha. It's only 7 years. So things happen in Ketu very quickly. And go back here. Things happen in Ketu very, very quickly. And at the end of Ketu Dasha is when Uncle Tom's Cabin was published. In fact, it started as like a serialized novel, and then it was formally published in Ketu Saturn right before Ketu Mercury. But again, this is like then this started to lead to the culture really changing, and then you had things like Fort Sumter and John Brown and all the other kind of things that started to occur, which led to finally firing weapons at each other. But the real cultural shift happened in this at the end of Ketu. And the one interesting thing something I really found interesting about this is Ketu doesn't rule anything because the nodes really rule through their nakshatras. But Ketu winds up going to the third house, which literally has to do with literature. It's different. There's a crossover between the second and the third house in speech. Right, speech and is both a second and a third house thing. The second house of speech is literally like the words that come out of your mouth. It's kind of like very personal speech that reflect your values. Third house speech are things you create, literally like writing and even all kinds of personal creativity. You can see it as very related to Gemini in this context of writing and mass kind of speech, and self-expression would be a better way even to say third house. So Ketu going in the third house of the Scorpio chart, I think makes more sense even as being the Mahadasha for when Uncle Tom's Cabin was published.
Yeah, and
Casey, would you like to add to that?
If you think about what Ketu is in the third house for a Scorpio person, it's the Rahu is always trying to grab onto these ideologies, right? Is this the thing that gets me to the highest place? And the third house is the part that's really established and poking holes in all those ideologies, right? And saying, no, that's not it. That doesn't make sense, because that's what the third house is. Does that make sense? Can you explain that? Can you prove it with, actual?
And in this context, it was Ketu shooting holes in this Rahu Mercury in the ninth that we were talking about. This story, this inspiring story. Oh, we're America, the shining city on the hill. And Ketu in the third is like, how can we be how can we be and live up to this inspiring promise when half the country is enslaved? Yeah. This is Ketu is like, look, I don't care how much it bothers you. I'm gonna drill into that problem. And Ketu in the third is going to be drilling into the hypocrisy of Rahu in the ninth and the ungrounded immaturity of Rahu in the ninth. That's always what Ketu does. Wherever Ketu is, he's sitting there reflecting back mainly against Rahu, and where Rahu is immature and undeveloped, Ketu is developed and reflecting back with relentless scrutiny. And that's how we wind up working through the polarity of the nodes. Rahu obsesses and is immature about what's going on, and Ketu sits back and says, see, this is a mistake. And we correct that polarization. And so that's also a perfect way to explain it, Casey. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's also the part of the American fabric that is really rebelling against forced agendas, right? Because the king in Britain was trying to force everybody to the new way of the New Testament, right? The new religion, and they didn't want to be forced to believe in that thing, which is why the colonies, part of why they split off was like they don't want anyone imposing their agenda on it. That's the third house thing, is to really impose your ideas. That ninth house is third house. The ninth house is our ideas and our ideals and our beliefs. The third house and the K2 in the third house is like rejecting any imposed beliefs on you.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's exactly, and again, you can even see this as built into what we're saying about the founding fathers and their rejection of a theocracy and of we're a Christian nation, and where they were like, no, we're not. We very clearly that you have the right to a free press. You have the right to speak. You have the right that there's not going to be an authority lording over you. And again, this is very ninth house stuff as well. There's no overarching theology, or, it's about individuals and their ability and their freedom to express themselves, freedom of the press. Again, exactly the same thing. Freedom of the press, K2 in the third, very much like that. Like, you have a free press. You can, and that mainly means the freedom to criticize the government. That's what it is. It's the freedom to criticize the government. Again, and for all the stuff that we're taught that we hear in the culture now about censorship and whatnot, there is no censorship when a platform removes you. Okay, you still have freedom you still have your First Amendment rights, because the government is not throwing you in jail for criticizing it. You can go on any platform and say what you want. The platform, because it's a business, has the right, because they also have rights, right? They have the right to say, we don't want you using our platform for this. That's literally their rights. But you're not getting, now if you get thrown in jail for doing it, that's a violation of your quote freedom of speech. That's what the freedom of speech is about. That you're not, because that's what they were rebelling against. They weren't allowed free speech in other countries. So again, very, very good way to put that. And again, the reason I talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin is even Abraham Lincoln greeted Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1862 as the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war. So this created a huge shift in the culture that happened. Again, it started 1853. So within like 3 years, or no, not 3 years. It was what, 1861 was the is that when the Civil War started? 1861, was it? Casey, I think
it was the election of 1860 that in between that, when Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, and it was in that period between when you're elected and when you actually took office.
Yeah, that's right.
That the states ceded from the Union, and then that started the war.
And so it started in Venus Rahu, like we said, but as we see the chart here, right after the election, which would have been Venus Rahu started October 1860.
And those are two separative energies, right? The 7th and 12th Lord was like, I don't want to do this agreement anymore. And Rahu is just separative by itself. It wants to rebel against it.
But also look at how accurate that is right after the election of 1860, literally.
Yeah, November 1860. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right when it started.
Right. And yeah. And so, and, even when we went up here, just to show even like that War of 1812, right when Saturn started, it was Saturn, mm-hmm. Right? The first. So again, these are very specific dates. And again, the thing is that you can see these same principles maintained. It's one thing to see one thing happen, but now we're going to look at these assassinations. We have Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley, and we also have a JFK assassination. Look at all the Jupiter subdashas. Jupiter subdasha. You see in the chart, just real quickly here, Jupiter. First of all, Jupiter is the indicator of the inspiring figure. Politicians very much are Jupiterian. They're leaders. Especially now in this day and age, we don't even look up to, it's not like a pope or a religious figure. You have to look at Jupiter in a much more universal way. Like rock stars are very Jupiterian. Things that inspire us, things that are trying to inspire us. Leaders are very Jupiterian, particularly in what we call, quote, a democracy. We don't live in a kingdom. We live in a democracy where the leaders, we're looking for someone to inspire us. Quote, they're elected. So these kinds of things, very Jupiterian in that context. Now, it's also the power figure, the power center, which would be the sun because they're the leader. But again, so these things are very interesting. And when you see that Jupiter, again, is in the 8th house, and again, Lincoln was assassinated in Venus, Jupiter. We already looked and see that Venus doesn't rule anything, but Venus has joined Jupiter in the 8th house, and Jupiter is the ruler of the sun because the sun is in Punarvasu Nakshatra. And again, the sun would be the king, the leader,
right,
and the power center, that focal point of power. So you look at how, again, it's just so crazy. And then Rahu, let's just look at the McKinley, Rahu Jupiter. Again, this is literally where the Mahadasha planet rules the Subdasha planet. This is a principle that I've been teaching for a decade, Casey, and some of my other advanced students, they run it like a playbook. You can see huge things are going to happen. And then Jfk Assassination, the same principle, but now instead of Rahu ruling Jupiter, it's Mercury ruling Jupiter. Because Jupiter has 2 rulers, Mercury in Gemini and Rahu in the nakshatra.
Same with the Garfield. Moon rules Rahu.
Moon rules Rahu. The same with Garfield. Very good.
Yeah.
Look at the rulerships again. Now, why is it Moon? Well, because the Moon is ruling. The Moon is the ruler of this difficult Rahu Mercury, this 8th and 9th Lord here. Or I'm sorry, this 9th house Rahu with the retrograde 8th Lord.
Yep.
So the Moon is the ruler of that, and it goes in the 4th house again. Moon is also the ruler of Ketu because Ketu is in Shravana.
Yep.
And understand this principle that the 3rd house is also definitely, it's not just a death house, but it can be a house of murder, and because it's the 8th from the 8th. It's this kind of concentrated 8th house energy. Anytime you get that compounding quality of, especially the Bhavam compounding, the 3rd house is the 8th from the 8th. It can be very destructive. It's one of the most destructive houses, by the way, is the 3rd. Because again, it's not just the 8th, it's the 8th from the 8th. So again, look at the 8th house in the chart and count 8 from it, you got the 3rd house.
And like we said, it's about imposing your will on something. And that's really what a murder is you impose your will onto them.
So I'd love your thoughts about this stuff, Casey, as well. So I just want to do these assassinations, but I know you have some great stuff to add as well.
Yeah, like I said, that Jupiter connection is talking about all it rules. It's pretty simple. All it rules is the sun in Punarvasu, and that's the 10th Lord, which is our leader, in the 8th house, which is death, right? So the leader dies, and then Venus being the ruler, Venus and Jupiter, that first one, Lincoln assassination, that Venus being in the 8th house, Jupiter being in the 8th house, that's piling up that 8th house, right? And what it rules is the sun. That's all that's ruled by Venus and Jupiter, is the leader getting killed, right, in the 8th house.
And there's something else. And there's always something else, but especially when you find principles pile up, which I know Case will appreciate and others will, there's also what are called Marika planets. Marika, the ruler of the 2nd house and the ruler of the 7th house. These are both Marika planets, which means killer planets.
Yeah.
It's right in Parashara, and Parashara really denigrates Marika planets. Mm-hmm. We don't talk about them very much, but they're very important, particularly if you're looking at stuff like this. This is when it gets to be important. Venus, Jupiter are the 2 Marikas because Jupiter rules the 2nd house and Venus rules the 7th house. So Venus, Jupiter are also the 2 Marika or killer planets. And so, again, this is another reason why. But even if you just look at the rulerships and the 8th house here and these same principles, you see it.
Right. So what we talked about at the beginning, you want to look for the 8th house Karaka, Saturn, the 8th house ruler, Mercury, and then any planets in the 8th house. Right? So Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Sun. And what do we see in all these dashas? Basically that, right? We've got Saturn Moon, we've got Rahu Jupiter, we've got Moon Rahu. Yeah, so it's all that is getting juiced up, right? The Moon is involved because it rules the 8th house ruler, right? So it activates the Mercury as the 8th house ruler, and then Rahu, which just amplifies that same indication, right?
Yep.
So,
Absolutely.
And if you think about our most dramatic ones that we've had, like that we can think of, is 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. Who's involved with both of those?
Right.
Saturn and the moon and Rahu, right? So.
And notice, so yeah, we'll go through these as well. There's a few others here. Look at this Pearl Harbor attack. Again, notice Pearl Harbor and 9/11 and also the War of 1812. All of them were on the homeland. Pearl Harbor, they attacked the homeland, Saturn Moon. Again, this is very clear. Saturn rules the moon in the 4th. Again, this principle of the Mahadasha planet ruling the Subdasha planet. Completely there. Saturn rules the moon in the 4th house. I've already said 4th house is the homeland. Saturn rules it, and the moon is there. It's couldn't be more clear. Also, the 9/11 terror attack. Now we have Moon, Rahu. Moon rules Rahu. And the moon is in the 4th house, and it's ruling the Rahu, the Rahu Mercury up here.
Right.
And again, Mercury is the 8th lord. Once you bring these rulerships in, it just nails it. U.S. dropped the atomic bomb. Saturn, Rahu.
Right.
Again, we don't need to say Rahu ruling planets in the 8th house. Saturn also ruling Mercury, Rahu through the nakshatra. I also put the moon landing in here. Notice how, this is, we have a good thing here. The moon landing, Ketu Rahu. So Ketu doesn't rule anything, but it's here in the 3rd house. And Rahu, of course, is also the ruler of Venus, Jupiter in the 8th. So here's a sudden shocking thing. It's not war or anything like that, but you also have Ketu Rahu now, which notice the thing I was saying. This is a kind of culmination of that innovation and relentless focus and scrutiny. Oh, by the way, I should have said this is when they faked the moon landing. Sorry.
Well, that node energy is that conspiracy shadow stuff coming up, right? So when you've got
this is when NASA faked the moon landing with technology and in the sound stage. Right. So
in a Ziploc bag, right? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. And so those of you out there who believe that it's a hoax, that here's your validate. It happened in K2 Rahu, right? And again, USA, we're full of conspiracies because we're Scorpio with all those planets in the 8th house. We love a good conspiracy. So this will confirm your conspiracy. No, but see, again, this is a real culmination of this 3rd and 9th house where our ideals that started with John Kennedy saying, by the end of the 60s, we're going to land someone on the moon and safely return him. It started when JFK said it, again, very aspirational, 9th house. We're going to do this thing. And then K2, 3rd house, we need to develop the technology. This is the power of K2 and the technology, the technological prowess of the U.S. and that spirit of innovation that's possible when we unleash the creativity, that K2 in the 3rd.
Right. K2 says we can't make it to the moon on hopes and prayers, right? We got to have some science involved in that thing.
We need to learn how to perpetrate a hoax.
Yeah.
Let's get against.
It's got to be convincing.
Yeah. We got to hire the best direct Stanley Kubrick.
That's right.
He just did 2000. We'll have him use the same sets that he used from 2001 Space Odyssey. By the way, in case you know, that's how they did it.
Oh, okay.
He had just filmed 2001 Space Odyssey, so he had all the camera, had it all there. All right, so again, you see how compelling these dates are and how the same consistent themes are coming because we're looking at these kind of events. And again, this is just an overall kind of indicator of the 20th century, the dashas here, as we can kind of just tick through where we've kind of been. Now, I started with stock market crash, but the stock market, the roaring 20s and all that would have been the Jupiter dasha, right? At the very end of Jupiter, it was Jupiter Rahu when the stock market, when we had the stock market crash. Whoops, sorry. Let me pull this up. When we had the stock market crash, let me come down here. You see Jupiter. Whoops, sorry. Let me pull this down.
And if you just think about what happened during that, what they call like Black Tuesday, is that it was panic selling, mass hysteria. And if you want to talk about mass hysteria, you're probably looking at Rahu.
Yeah, right? Jupiter Rahu, yeah.
And so who rules Rahu is Saturn, right? So And
With
and
that,
right before Saturn Dasha is Jupiter, Rahu, right? Jupiter Rahu is what leads us into it.
yeah. So it's Jupiter Rahu, and you can see this is really started in 1914, which is it's right after World War I or like right around here. But this Roaring '20s and this kind of a lot of corruption. There was a lot. That's what led to it. Is all the corrupt practices. And then so Saturn started, and again you can see these sort of epochs in history. And again, I'll just tick through them sort of quickly here. Again, so we started the Great Depression. Well, Saturn. Figure that, right? Aspect the ascendant. We're in the Great Depression through World War II. Again, through World War II, again, that was about a 20-year cycle, the Great Depression through World War II. And then Mercury, post-World War II innovation. I'm sorry, let me bring up this chart so we can see the dates. So yeah, we have, again, Saturn 1930 and then Mercury 1949. So again, this is right after World War II.
Which was also the Cold War and the Korea and Vietnam, right? If you want to say Mercury brings that 8th house, right? All that stuff in the 8th house.
All of that, yes. Yeah. So you can see the first thing that we see, it's again, Saturn is from the Depression through the end of the World War II. And then I also put Mercury innovation because, again, it's that whole thing. Mercury is the 8th lord, which shows why America has always been innovative. We were innovative with that new form of government that wasn't a monarchy, checks and balances, that kind of innovation on the verge of being paranoid because we don't want to be dominated by kings again. So again, it's this Mercury quality that also has that spirit of innovation and all of that. But again, it back into wars. Again, Korean War, Vietnam War was also there for sure. No question. That was also very dominant. And they were simultaneous because we developed a nuclear bomb at that time. I forgot to look at the date of the nuclear bomb, which we'll also do. But we also developed a bomb. We got into the Cold War. Again, very, very good point there. Then the K2, I'll just tick through these quick and then we can go back. K2 from 66 to 73. So again, this is the end of this was really when the 60s cultural revolution really happened. And again, we already saw K2 sticking his finger in the eye of the man.
They called it counterculture, right?
Counterculture.
K2,
right. It started earlier, but again, 67, the Summer of Love, 68, 69, 70, Woodstock, all of that up through the mid 70s. This is, by the way, right when Richard Nixon got impeached. And then we started a whole new thing from Venus till the mid 90s. Again, look, that's a long cycle. And again, this was the mid 70s through like the Reagan and the Republican years. This is the way I see it. And again, it was a lot of that sort of me generation, a lot of the disillusionment from the 60s by the mid 70s, certainly by the end of the 70s, had gotten sort of diluted. And this is when really started all the corporatism more than anything in the culture. The corporate tax rate changed, the progressive tax rate change, all this kind of stuff changed by the Sundasha by the mid 90s. This was when we sort of then had like the sort of Clinton years. I also call it like the corporatization years, when it became sort of corporatized, where corporatization really took hold. We haven't been since then. Actually, it started earlier, but since then it became just mainstream corporatizing. Moon and the Bush era is also very interesting because, again, we think, well, George Bush, what that was dominated by 9/11, these kinds of things. But
yeah, the war on terror. Yeah,
war on terror. But look at this: Moon ruling Mercury, Rahu in the ninth. Again, look at the rulerships and all this resurgence of patriotism.
Yeah,
the flag everywhere, military flag everywhere, and George Bush definitely Mr. Emotional. You can see he's not. They liked him. He was emotional. He was very, by the way, he was also Cancer ascendant. But it would be interesting to go back and look. Clinton, very kind of like sun sort of nature. Bush, very much moon nature. But again, also quite emotional in this regard. Bush would cry pretty easily as well. He would get emotional and teary. So again, if we look at that era here, that's 1999 to 2009. This was right in that sort of transition. And then Obama's years was the 2009 to like 2016. Again,
Right. And
Obama,
if you think about what he did, his biggest contribution was healthcare, right? And what is Mars? The sixth house ruler, about, health and disease and curing problems, right? That's the sixth house. And the first house is about your body and its health, right? So Mars being the theme of healthcare and Obamacare and making it accessible for people.
and then we're here now. So yeah, I just went over them quickly. Casey, I'd like to hear your thoughts about all of these. I just wanted to go over them so we saw them, then we can talk about them a little more. But what are your feelings about these?
Yeah, like the Great Depression being Saturn makes total sense, right? And World War II and all of that, like death, and it's the eighth house Karaka, the third and fourth house, right? It was, and if you think about like the baby boomers, they're very self-contained people, right? It's during the America's Saturn Dasha, and for a Scorpio ascendant, Saturn is a very like control your emotions and be practical type of energy.
And by the way, it's also very interesting. I just want to say this real quick: is that Sun? We really started to see that boomer generation in the Sun. That's when, since like the mid '90s, that's really when the boomer generation has been like, because the boomer generation then turned like 40 or 50 or whatever. The Clinton, Bush, all of the people that were the boomers, the classic boomers, really started to take control in the Sun, in the Sun Dasha. I'm sorry.
But what else happened in the 90s was like Microsoft, right? The Sun goes into Gemini. And so then computers started taking off. The age of computers started right there in that Sun Dasha. And so that's really Gemini energy. The 10th Lord and the 8th is now we're all looking into our screens, right? It's like the very 8th house. We're all stuck in our houses looking at our phones. So that's very Sun in the 8th house, right? And then Moon during the Bush era, and like I said, the war on terror and that whole thing. And also, like you said, what happened during 9/11 is everyone is the height of everyone working together, coming together over this tragedy, right? And so the Moon is about everyone coming together, right? And the tragedy is Moon rules the 8th house ruler and Rahu, and so all that 8th house, right? So it's that tragedy, and we're coming together over the tragedy.
So it's that again, people say, why does the Moon rule war on terror? Again, if you don't understand, then you're like, yeah, that makes no sense. Why isn't it Saturn? Why isn't it the bad ones? Because it's what the planets rulerships. And again, think of how the war on terror even is nothing but just an emotional meme. It's an emotional hot button. And again, but it was a very emotional time. Let's just be clear, emotional time. Right. And patriotism. Again, this is the Moon in the 4th shows that patriotism, like I said earlier. But it was really the rise of a newfound patriotism. Yeah. It was very much the beginning of that. And again, the war on terror, 8th Lord, Mercury rules. Or I'm sorry, the Moon rules the Rahu Mercury. If anything, that Rahu is exacerbating Mercury, the 8th Lord, and that paranoid fear and war on terror. And literally, talk about conspiracies and conspiratorial background as well. This is also why you can see so much conspiracy, because, by the way, right away I saw, whether people think it's a conspiracy or not, I've never seen 2 buildings fall at the weight of gravity unless there was a demolition. Maybe you have. Show me another video of buildings that were not demolished that fall at the weight of gravity, at the speed of gravity. Yeah, fine steel beams snapping like twigs just because of the top is heavy. At some point, the structure would have held. It would have fallen a few floors, and then all that structure would have held. 2 buildings falling at the weight of gravity. I ain't buying it. Sorry. So that's one that you say it's a conspiracy theory. I my own eyes tell me that does not look right. The only time I've ever seen buildings fall at the weight of gravity is when there was a demolition.
And that's all that Moon and Rahu energy, right? Ruling the 8th house ruler and Rahu. So it's like doubling down on that Rahu energy, which is like, what does it mean? What does it mean? Trying to project meaning into everything. And so, yeah.
And knowing how or why, I don't go further, but all I know is I don't think that's what happened.
Yeah. Right.
And so but again, so that moon Rahu in the ninth, or I'm sorry, the moon ruling Rahu Mercury in the ninth really shows that sort of patriotism sort of overcoming. And again, because the moon is also in the fourth.
And then not to forget that it also rules that Ketu in the third, where everyone's going, wait, this doesn't make sense, right? Just like you were saying, that doesn't, you're selling this, but that doesn't make sense.
Some people are. I was surprised even at the time that hardly no one really looked at it very closely.
Yeah.
And everyone, look, I was definitely of a ripe age then. I was already early. I was, late 30s, early 40 during the time in the march up to the war. And it was shocking how quickly everyone just completely stopped thinking critically. Completely. No one was thinking critically. Everyone was like, and the meme was the liberation of Iraq. The liberation of Iraq. That was the meme that was put in the media all the time. The liberation of Iraq, liberation of Iraq. Not that we're going to go to war in the Middle East for God knows how long. Not that we're going to open Pandora's box in the Middle East and occupy the Middle East. It was the liberation of Iraq, liberation of Iraq. And everyone said, no, be quick, easy. I mean, everyone just collectively it was all patriotism. And if you questioned it, you absolutely, everyone, but I think one senator and one congressperson voted for it. Almost all of them did. Because
if you're going to sell an ideal, if you're going to do it during Moon Rahu, that's for sure in this chart.
Because of the pressure of patriotism. It shouldn't be overlooked. That was very much Moon, and very much this Moon in the fourth, like I said. Again, if it's Sagittarius, the Moon is in the third. This Scorpio is very much Moon in the fourth. Plus Scorpio, we're emotional country, emotional people.
Yeah.
And that moon cycle, we were very emotional about something that we really needed to be more practical about. We weren't really thinking, and we were just trusting. Colin Powell, the great general. So again, huge time. And then Obama comes as Mars. Again, he was very kind of, you could see how he was very Mars-like.
Yeah, it's Mars is that planet of wanting to be decisive and take action and move forward. And his motto was change, right? That he was a change agent, right? That's what Mars is for a Scorpio.
And
right?
a few other things just real quick is Mars is the ruling planet. And I remember when Obama was elected, it was very much like America. It's almost like a reset. Like, we've elected a black president. We have turned over a new leaf. Like it was really like a new beginning for the country. It felt like that at the time, for sure. And again, we elected a black president. He was youthful. He was articulate. He was inspiring, right? Mars is also the ruler, we can't forget, of Saturn, because it's in Chitra Nakshatra, and it's aspecting the ascendant. So Mars rules the ascendant. Mars also rules the moon in Dhanishta, if this time adheres, which we think it does. I think if it's a little further, it might move into Sagittarius and still be in Scorpio. But I think Dhanishta, this would also really play, because Mars, as the ruler of Dhanishta, would also activate that moon in the fourth as well. And that feeling that we had when Obama was elected. So again, but it also goes in the eighth house. He was a reformer. He was definitely a transformative figure. And one could say he led to Trump, because a lot of the backlash, particularly against the racial part of it, one could easily say Trump rode that sort of hobby horse, and the outrage and stoked by racial aggravation and white people feeling like they're losing their country. Again, it wasn't all racial, but certainly the diversity of the country was not welcome, and Trump used that rhetoric. And of course, that's where we're at now since then, since 2016.
Right, and it lined up perfectly with Rahu, right, where we're looking for that answer, right? That's in the ninth house. Rahu in the ninth house is like, what is the answer? And I'm willing to try anything to have it, right? So
you can see the shocking reality. Who would have thought, again, if you were to go back to 2015, who would have thought that literally 5 years later, we're where we are now? And again, you could really see. And again, I really love this about the Rahu Dasha starting August 2016. This was right after again, before that time, before the late summer, we thought something would happen and Trump would get derailed or something. But by this time, it was like, no, we're going to be dealing with him. And even if he loses, we're going to be dealing with this guy and what he has unleashed for a long time now. Again,
Right.
some people think it's reformers, a reform or, whatever. But whether you agree with him or not or whatever, it's just blown things apart. It's very eighth house, transformative, and chaotic. This is one of the main hallmarks of Rahu is chaos, and he's
Right.
definitely a chaos agent, if nothing else.
Right. Yeah. It rules those two planets in the eighth house, and then it's also joined the eighth house ruler. So it's just going to be that it's going to blow up that, like I said, the change agent in a dramatic way, in a confusing way, in a way that doesn't really line up when you try to put the details in alignment.
And so as we see here, just go down, we have so right now we're here and we just started and we're going into Rahu Saturn. So again, this last election was Rahu Jupiter. I did this in my 2020 election that we were in the Rahu Dasha and we were in Rahu Jupiter. And so we were looking for a figure that would be more that would be more inspiring to try to take us out of some of the main themes that Rahu had already started. So I think it's one of the reasons Biden was elected is because he at least looked to be more stable in this context. A lot of other things, but
right.
Then we're going into Rahu
Jupiter
Saturn.
is really the role model, right? What is the one that can demonstrate what you want to follow?
Yeah, and just again, what happens at the beginning of a dasha is we see it in its full glory or detriment. And actually, since Rahu Jupiter started, even before the election, this was also when the impeachments started. And Jupiter is very much about the justice and the whatnot, but this is when a lot of this stuff through 2019, from the middle of 2019 onward, this is when Trump had the call with the Ukrainian, and there was all of that stuff. A lot of these scandals started to come out with Trump in our government. Again, of course, we have this Jupiter. Jupiter is, again, it's the ruler of the sun. So remember, and again, if you remember the other Jupiter cycles, we had assassinations. We had three of the four assassinations happened in the Jupiter subcycle. So this was an assassination, but Jupiter, of course, is in the eighth house, and it's the ruler of the sun, which would be the leader. So you saw even in the chart of the U.S. that the sun, or that the leader was really pressured here in Rahu Jupiter. The current leader was impeached and also mounted insurrections and brought enormous scandal, even in the last election.
And almost died of COVID.
Almost died of COVID. Yeah, the leader almost died. In fact, I predicted when it happened that if he's on the verge of death, I said it, and it's been affirmed that if he wasn't who he was and he did not get all those emergency interventions when he did, he would have died. You could see it pretty clearly. I did videos on that.
Yeah.
So Casey, your comments on this? I'll let you comment on these last few things.
Yeah, these last dashas, especially Rahu Saturn, is those two difficult energies. Rahu and Saturn are difficult, malefic energies, but with that comes that, a malefic energy is something that obstructs, right? It kind of separates us from the status quo. So if the status quo is unhealthy, then you need those malefics to kind of separate us from those unhealthy patterns. So those are things that are possible in this current dasha. And Saturn being the third and the fourth house ruler really gets us focused on more of our own country, right? Like it's the fourth house ruler and the third. So it's more wanting to, like Biden's is to restructure America, right? His big policy is to do the frameworks, right? Is the third and the fourth house to restructure the roads and all that stuff, right?
Infrastructure.
Yeah, infrastructure bill, right? So third and fourth house is really focusing on the homeland and how to get that back on track through third house things as new ideas. Let's try some new things. Let's get us back running with the infrastructure. But yeah, that's the basics of it is that Saturn energy we've seen in the past can bring some of those difficult situations, but it also can be that really innovative energy also, right? As that K2, it activates K2, it activates the moon, it activates Rahu and Mercury in Pusha. So all of those things are obviously difficult when you can feel it. You can feel it ever since that started, the Rahu Saturn started. Difficult, like the Omicron, we just thought we were moving out of the pandemic, and it's like closed back down on us as soon as Saturn started.
Well, it's interesting to see the transits right now too, that Saturn is going over these planets, going through the third house.
Yeah.
It'll be going through the fourth house. So in that context as well. And yeah, I said when COVID started, I said it was going to be, it was going to drag on through the Saturn, through Capricorn. I'd hoped I would be wrong after we got past Delta. I was like, well, maybe not. And I'm like, I don't know. This transit looks like it's going to be what it is. And so I think, without getting too sidetracked, that we'll be dealing with that for half this year, and then we're going to start to get past it. But I did want to make sure to mention, I don't know if I did talk about the atomic bomb, because it's a big one. That was Saturn Rahu. So you can really see, again, this really shows the real malefic qualities, because then it's not only functional malefics but natural malefics as well. Mm-hmm. Saturn Rahu, these are two of the worst, two of the most cruel planets, just naturally and functionally. Of course, Rahu rules that Venus, Jupiter in the 8th. Rahu rules those two Marika planets. Yeah. And Saturn, of course, is Saturn, like we've already said, aspecting the ascendant. It also rules Ketu. It also rules the moon. But especially Saturn rules that Mercury Rahu in the 9th. So again, when we see Saturn Rahu, and Saturn is ruling Rahu, again, Saturn is ruling Rahu in the 9th. So all of that cruel potential, and again, we could go down this forever, but atomic energy and whatnot is very much Rahu stuff, hidden power, total Rahu, Ketu, both. And again, Saturn rules both. It rules Rahu and Ketu. And so that devastating act of dropping the bombs, Saturn Rahu. And again, it really comes together when you have this chart, this Scorpio chart, in my view, because you see all this 8th house rulership. You see all the rulerships even of, and the aspect of Saturn on the ascendant.
Yeah, so I think just to wrap this up, that we just kind of proposed a lot of ideas here, but I think it's all just a way to present this idea that you've kind of initiated a year and a half ago. But with this, it's kind of add in a little more depth and texture to it. So if you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with us. And it's been cool to do this with you live and kind of work through some of the things. We did the research and saw that it was showing these principles, but doing it live and having this conversation has been really enlightening.
Yeah, it's fun. And the other thing to understand is that you're seeing two astrologers in the way they work, right? This is also, you're seeing why this isn't just, I think it's this based on the psychological stuff, but you're seeing how you take all of those principles that we were just talking about, even when we talked about it up here, when we talked about the chart here and all of these things, we didn't just say, I think this. Then you go down and you start looking at the events, and the events make it happen, show the karma happening. It shows the stuff we were talking about in the chart happening. And this is the way we work. So these honestly, these are the kinds of case studies that I think astrologers should present when you're doing a kind of rectification. And by the way, someone wants to say Sagittarius. I'd love to see this. I'd love to see it too. I'd love to see that case being made. I'm sure they could, but this is how you do the case study. You don't just, it's not just one thing. Go through all these events and show the methods that you're using and show them working every time. Yeah. Show them keep working, right? And why, and then you have a good case study. So that's what Casey and I are doing. And yeah, the same with me, Casey. It's been great. I'm glad you picked up the ball and ran with it. Casey's been great with that. He studied with me a few years ago. He hadn't really studied before, but he took on he took it on, and that practical way that the classes are unfolded, especially the certification course, really resonated with him. And he took and went deeply into all these methods. And then he's a great researcher, as you can see. Scorpio, Mars, Virgo, Capricorn, great researchers, loves to take the ball and run with it. So Casey, when you sent me that couple, I don't know when it was, about a month and a half ago or so, and you're like, I looked at this, I'm like, awesome, because I start with it, but then, you know, I'm busy and I start doing other things. So it's great to have you there, really, you know, nailing it down.
Perfect. Thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah. And, you know, maybe it's a little bit of me because I'm a Jfk Ascendant with K2 in the 3rd and Rahu in the 9th going, hey, I think it might be. It's like me.
Casey Scott, American.
That's right.
Great. All right, man. Well, it was great to have you here. And
thanks for having
folks,
me.
I'll have a link to that handout as well. So you can get that handout as well, and download it and share it. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks.